My name is Raymond Castellano, and the morning my daughter called me for the first time in 8 years, her voice shaking with an emotion I couldn't quite place yet, was also the morning I learned that a camera crew from a national news network had aired a 5-minute segment about my diner the night before, and that half the country had apparently seen it before my own children did. I was flipping eggs at the griddle when my phone started buzzing on the counter beside me, over and over, the way a phone buzzes when something has happened that the person holding it doesn't yet understand. I ignored it the first 4 times, the way I ignore most calls before the breakfast rush finishes, until Danny Cruz, who has run the front counter of my diner for the better part of a decade, came into the kitchen holding his own phone, his face doing something I'd never quite seen it do before. "Ray, you need to see this." He turned the screen toward me, and there I was, my own face, on a national morning show segment that had aired the previous evening, a 5-minute feature about a small-town diner in Texas that had spent 15 years quietly feeding veterans every single Sunday, free of charge, no questions asked, no strings attached. The segment had my name in the caption at the bottom of the screen: Raymond Castellano, owner, Castellano's Diner, Marfa, Texas. It had Danny in it too, describing what the diner had done for him when he'd shown up 8 years earlier with nowhere else to go. It had 24 veterans sitting at long tables on a Sunday morning, the same tables I'd been setting up every week since, before some of those men were even out of high school. I stood there at the griddle with a spatula in my hand, watching a version of my own life play back to me on a phone screen, and I hadn't even fully processed what I was looking at when my phone rang again. This time a name I hadn't seen on that screen in 8 years. Patricia stared at it for 3 full rings before answering. "Hello, Dad." Her voice cracked on the single syllable. "Dad, I just saw you on the Today Show. Someone sent me the clip this morning. I don't even know how many people have sent it to me at this point." "Dad, why didn't you ever tell us you were doing this?" I stood in that kitchen, the smell of eggs and bacon grease thick in the air, the same as it had been every morning for 31 years. And I felt something complicated rise up in my chest. Something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite relief, something closer to the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent 8 years building a life entirely without his children's knowledge, only to have that life handed back to them by a television network instead of by me. "You never asked, Patricia," I said quietly. "None of you have asked me a single question about my life in 8 years." The silence on the line stretched out long enough that I could hear her breathing change. "I know," she finally said. "I know, Dad. I'm calling because I want that to change. But I understand if it's too late for you to believe that right now." I didn't know, standing at that griddle with a phone in one hand and a spatula in the other, whether it was too late or not. To understand how I got to that Tuesday morning, and how a national television network ended up knowing more about my daily life than my own children did, I need to back up considerably further than a 5-minute segment on a morning show. I grew up in Odessa, Texas, the son of an oil field roughneck, and a woman who cleaned houses for families with more money than sense, and I enlisted in the Marine Corps the week after I turned 18 in 1971 because it was the only path out of that town that made any sense to a boy with my particular set of options. I served 2 tours in Vietnam, and I want to be honest that I don't talk much about what happened over there, not because I'm ashamed of my service, but because some of what I saw doesn't translate well into words, and some of it I've simply chosen to carry privately, rather than hand off to anyone else to carry alongside me. What I will say is that a man named Tommy Reyes served beside me for both of those tours, a kid from El Paso with an easy laugh and an instinct for keeping the rest of us calm during the moments that tested every ounce of calm a person had left. Tommy died in an ambush outside Quang Tri in the spring of 1972, pulling 2 of our squad members out of a kill zone before a round caught him that should have caught me instead, given where I'd been standing 30 seconds earlier. I came home from that war carrying Tommy's memory the way a lot of veterans carry the memories of the men who didn't make it back with them, heavy, private, and permanent. I made myself a promise standing at his grave the week I got back stateside, a promise I never announced to anyone, that I would spend whatever years I had left making sure the men who did come home from wars, mine and every war that followed, never had to feel forgotten the way I sometimes felt, quietly, walking through a country that had mostly moved on from thinking about us at all. I met my wife Sandra in 1976, working the counter at a diner in Marfa that I eventually bought, with her help and a small business loan, in 1983. Sandra had a way of making every single customer, feel like the most important person who'd walked through that door that day. And together we built Castellano's Diner into the kind of place 3 generations of families in that part of West Texas grew up eating breakfast in. We raised 2 kids in the apartment above that diner before we could afford a proper house, our daughter Patricia and our son Michael. And I want to be honest that the diner absorbed enormous amounts of my time and energy over the decades, the same way any small business run by its owner tends to. In 1998, on the 25th anniversary of Tommy's death, I decided to finally act on the promise I'd made at his grave a quarter-century earlier. I started what I simply called Sunday mornings, a standing invitation for any veteran, any war, any circumstance, to come to Castellano's Diner every Sunday and eat completely free. No questions asked about whether they could afford it, no forms to fill out, no proof of service required beyond their own word. Sandra supported the idea immediately and completely, helping me figure out how to absorb the cost into the diner's margins without ever making it feel like charity to the men and women who showed up. The program grew slowly over the years, from 4 or 5 regulars in the beginning to, by the time the television crew found us, close to 30 veterans most Sundays, some from Vietnam like myself, plenty more from Iraq and Afghanistan, men and women who'd come home to a country that too often forgot to ask how they were actually doing once the parades ended. Danny Cruz showed up at Castellanos 8 years ago, an Army veteran of 2 tours in Iraq, homeless at the time, sleeping in his truck in a Walmart parking lot 2 towns over, having driven to Marfa on a rumor he'd heard from another veteran about a diner that fed guys like him for free on Sundays. I remember the first time I saw him, thin, exhausted, the particular hollow look of a man who has stopped expecting anything good to happen to him. He ate that first Sunday in near silence, and I made a point, the way I always did with new faces, of sitting with him for a few minutes afterward, not prying, just present. Danny kept coming back. Within a couple of months, he started showing up early to help set up tables before the other veterans arrived. Within a year, I'd offered him a real job, running the front counter, and helped him find a small apartment 2 blocks from the diner. Danny has been the closest thing to a son I've had, in the years since, who actually shows up. And I mean that with all the complicated weight that comparison carries, given the actual state of my relationship with my own children during that same stretch of years. Sandra passed 9 years ago, a stroke that took her within a matter of hours, and her death is where the long silence between my children and me actually began, though it took a business dispute the following year to turn that grief into the kind of rupture that lasts 8 years without a phone call. Patricia had moved to Dallas for a corporate job by then, and Michael had settled in Austin, running a small tech startup that was at the time burning through money faster than it was bringing any in. Within about a year of Sandra's death, Michael came to me with a proposal, well-intentioned in his own mind, I believe, though it landed on me at the worst possible moment. He wanted me to sell the diner, cash out the equity that had built up in the building and the business over 4 decades, and split the proceeds between the 3 of us early, rather than waiting for it to eventually pass through an estate. He needed capital for his company. Patricia, going through her own financial strain after a divorce, supported the idea, seeing it as a practical solution to 2 different problems at once. I refused, not because I didn't want to help my children, but because that diner had become, in the years since Sandra's death, the single place on earth that still felt like her, the counter she'd worked behind for decades, the kitchen where she'd taught me half of what I knew about actually running a restaurant, the Sunday program we'd built together as a tribute to a promise I'd made long before I ever met her. Selling it felt, to me, like erasing the last physical trace of a life she and I had spent 40 years building. The conversation that followed, over a phone call I still remember in painful detail, escalated in ways I've regretted the tone of ever since, even though I've never regretted the underlying decision. Michael accused me of caring more about a building full of memories than about my own children's futures. I accused him of wanting to cash out his mother's legacy for a business venture that even he privately admitted was struggling. Patricia, drawn into the argument on her brother's side, said something I've never fully been able to shake loose from my memory, that I was choosing to spend money feeding strangers for free every Sunday while my own children struggled, and that maybe if I actually cared about family the way I claimed to, I'd understand where my priorities should actually be. I didn't fully understand, in the heat of that argument, how deeply that particular accusation would end up shaping the following 8 years. I told them both, in words sharper than I'm proud of, that the diner wasn't for sale, that the Sunday program wasn't up for negotiation, and that if they couldn't respect a decision about their own mother's legacy, maybe we needed some distance from each other for a while. I meant a few weeks of cooling off. What I got was 8 years of silence. I called Patricia on her birthday every year for the first 3 years. She let it go to voicemail every time, and I eventually stopped leaving messages when it became clear she wasn't going to call back. I sent Michael a card every Christmas, and receiving nothing in return eventually wore down even my own stubborn persistence. Neither of them called when I had a minor health scare 5 years ago, a scare Danny found about only because I mentioned it to him in passing. And it was Danny, not either of my own children, who drove me to the hospital and sat in the waiting room until the doctors cleared me. I never fully understood during those 8 years whether my children genuinely believed the accusation Patricia had made that day, that I cared more about strangers than about them, or whether it had simply become easier, over time, to let the silence calcify into something neither side knew how to break first. I know I carried my own share of stubborn pride through those years, refusing to be the one who called first every single time, telling myself that the ones who'd walked away owed the first step back. The Sunday program, meanwhile, kept growing. Word spread slowly through veteran networks across West Texas, and eventually beyond it, men and women driving 2-3 hours some Sundays just to sit at those long tables and eat a meal that came with no judgment attached to it. I funded most of it out of the diner's modest profit margin over the years, along with a small trickle of donations that started arriving once local veterans started telling other veterans, and I never once considered it a sacrifice in the way Patricia had framed it during that argument. I considered it the one promise I'd made in my entire life, that I intended to keep without exception, the promise I'd made at Tommy Reyes's grave 50 years earlier. About 4 months before that television crew arrived, a producer named Karen Voss called the diner. After hearing about the Sunday program from a veterans advocacy group she'd been working with on an unrelated story, she wanted to do a feature, part of a national series on grassroots support for veterans, and I agreed reluctantly. Mostly because Danny convinced me it might help more veterans in more towns learn that programs like this one existed and could be replicated elsewhere. The crew spent 3 days filming that October, capturing a Sunday morning at the diner in full swing, interviewing half a dozen veterans about what the program had meant to them, interviewing Danny about his own journey from a Walmart parking lot to running the front counter of a business he now considered as much his own as mine. I gave a brief interview myself, mentioning Tommy Reyes only in passing, uncomfortable, as I always am, putting too much of my own story in front of a camera. The segment aired on a Monday evening, and I want to be honest that I didn't watch it live, having gone to bed early after a long Sunday shift the day before. I found out it had aired at all only when Danny showed me the clip the following morning, already circulating widely enough online that strangers across the country had apparently spent an entire evening watching my life story before either of my own children had heard a single word about it from me directly. Patricia's call came about 40 minutes after Danny showed me that clip. "Dad, I just saw you on the Today Show. Someone sent me the clip this morning. I don't even know how many people have sent it to me at this point. Dad, why didn't you ever tell us you were doing this?" I stood in that kitchen, the smell of eggs and bacon grease thick in the air, and I felt something complicated rise up in my chest. "You never asked, Patricia. None of you have asked me a single question about my life in 8 years." The silence on the line stretched out long enough that I could hear her breathing change. "I know," she finally said. "I know, Dad. I'm calling because I want that to change. But I understand if it's too late for you to believe that right now. What exactly did the segment show you?" I asked. "That made you decide to call today instead of any day in the last 8 years." The question landed harder than I intended it to, and I heard her breath catch. "That's fair," she said quietly. "I don't have a good answer that doesn't sound as bad as it probably is. I watched a 5-minute clip of you feeding 30 veterans every single Sunday for 15 years, funding most of it yourself, and it forced me to actually look at how I'd been telling myself a story about you for 8 years that had nothing to do with who you actually are." "What story was that?" "That you cared more about strangers than about your own family. That you chose the diner and some abstract cause over Michael and me when we needed help." Watching that segment, Dad, I realized I'd built an entire narrative in my head that let me justify not calling you, and it took a television network, showing me the truth for me to actually question whether that narrative was fair. I sat down heavily on an overturned crate in the kitchen, my legs suddenly feeling less steady than they had a few minutes earlier. "It wasn't ever about not caring about you and Michael," I said. "It was about a promise I made to a friend who died saving my life 50 years ago, and a program your mother helped me build as a tribute to that promise. I never once stopped loving either one of you during those 8 years. I just stopped being willing to be the only one making the effort." "I understand that now," Patricia said. "I don't expect you to just open the door back up because a TV segment embarrassed me into calling. But I'd like the chance to actually earn my way back into your life. Slowly, if you're willing to let me try." Michael called 2 days later, having apparently seen the segment through his own social media feed, his voice carrying a mixture of shame and defensiveness that took him most of the call to work through. "Dad, I've been sitting with this for 2 days, trying to figure out what to even say to you. Watching that segment, seeing Danny talk about what you did for him, seeing all those veterans, I kept thinking about the argument we had, about me accusing you of not caring about family. I think I owe you a real apology, not just for the argument itself, but for spending 8 years letting my own pride keep me from ever picking up the phone to actually understand what you were doing with your life." "Your company," I said carefully. "Did it ever recover after you didn't get the capital from selling the diner?" There was a pause. "It folded actually about a year after our argument. I ended up taking a job at a bigger firm instead, which honestly turned out better for me long-term, but I think some part of me held on to resentment about the diner because it was easier than admitting the business might have failed anyway, capital or not. "I'm sorry it folded," I told him, and meant it, despite everything. "I'm not calling to ask for anything, Dad. I want to be really clear about that. I'm calling because I watched a stranger's camera crew capture more of who you actually are than I've bothered to learn in almost a decade, and that's on me, not on you." The weeks that followed brought a flood of attention I hadn't anticipated when I'd reluctantly agreed to that interview months earlier. The segment kept circulating, picked up by larger outlets, shared by veterans organizations across the country, and donations to the Sunday program started arriving faster than Danny and I could properly track them, enough that we eventually had to set up a formal nonprofit structure just to manage it responsibly, something Danny took the lead on with an aptitude for organization I hadn't fully appreciated until circumstances forced it into the open. Patricia flew in from Dallas 3 weeks after that first phone call, on a weekend rather than for any special occasion, simply to be present, she said, in a way she hadn't managed in 8 years. She sat at the counter of the diner on a Tuesday morning, watching me work the griddle the same way I had for 31 years, and something in her face, watching that ordinary routine, seemed to settle in a way the television segment alone hadn't been able to accomplish. "I forgot how much I used to love sitting right here as a kid," she said. "Watching you and Mom work together like this. You used to do your homework on that exact stool," I told her. "I remember," she said softly. "I don't know when I stopped remembering that this was ever a place I loved, instead of just a place I resented for taking up so much of your time." Danny, watching this reunion unfold with the particular quiet attentiveness he brings to most things, pulled Patricia aside at one point that weekend. "Your dad talks about you and Michael more than you probably realize," he told her. "Even during the years you weren't calling. He kept every birthday card he ever sent you that came back unopened, in a box in the back office. I don't think he ever really let go of hoping you'd both come back around eventually." Patricia found that box herself later that weekend, going through the back office out of simple curiosity. 3 years of unopened birthday cards, each one addressed in my own handwriting, each one carrying a small note inside that she read for the first time that afternoon, sitting alone in that back office with tears. She later told me she hadn't expected to cry that hard over something as small as an opened envelope. Michael visited about a month later, driving in from Austin on a Saturday, specifically to attend a Sunday morning at the diner, sitting quietly at one of the long tables among the veterans, listening to their stories, watching his father move among them with the same easy warmth I'd apparently shown strangers for 15 years while he'd convinced himself I had nothing left over for my own family. "I owe some of these guys an apology too, weirdly," he told me afterward. "I spent years being resentful of exactly this, without ever once actually sitting in this room to see what it really was. The reconciliation with both of my children didn't happen all at once, And I want to be honest that 8 years of silence doesn't undo itself in a handful of visits, however meaningful those visits turned out to be. There were harder conversations still ahead, about the specific words said during that original argument, about years of missed birthdays and holidays that couldn't simply be waved away by a shared realization prompted by a television segment. But something had genuinely shifted, a door that had been closed for 8 years finally standing open again. Even if walking back through it fully was going to take considerably longer than a single viral clip, about 6 months after that segment first aired, the diner hosted its largest Sunday gathering yet, close to 50 veterans filling every table and spilling out onto the sidewalk with folding chairs, a milestone celebration marking the program's 15th anniversary that year. Patricia flew in for it, and Michael drove up from Austin, and for the first time in almost a decade, both of my children stood in that diner together, helping serve food alongside Danny and me, the same way Sandra and I once imagined our whole family might someday do without anyone having to force the occasion. A reporter from a local paper, covering the anniversary event, asked me at one point what the whole experience had taught me: the television segment, the reconciliation with my children, the unexpected scale the program had grown to. It taught me that the people who love you don't always show it the way you expect them to, I told her. And sometimes it takes something as strange as a stranger's camera crew to remind everyone involved what actually matters, before too much more time gets lost to pride nobody really benefits from holding on to. I looked around that crowded sidewalk that afternoon, at Tommy Reyes's memory still quietly present in every single Sunday this program had ever hosted, at Danny, who came to me with nothing and became in every way that matters, a son, at Patricia and Michael, finally present again after 8 long years. And I understood something I don't think I'd have understood as clearly without a television network, forcing all of it into the open in a way none of us had managed to force on our own. Family isn't measured by the years you let slip away in silence. It's measured by whether you're still willing, when the chance finally comes, to walk back through the door. If this story reminded you of someone you've let too much time pass without calling, whether out of pride, hurt, or simple habit, maybe today's the day to be the one who picks up the phone first, rather than waiting for some unexpected circumstance to force the reunion for you. And if this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe for more true stories about family, service, and the people who quietly show up for others long before the world ever notices.